So
Hi, AJ. Who the hell are you?
I'm AJ Hartley. I'm a novelist and a Shakespeare professor.
A what?
Shakespeare professor.
A what?
I am. I'm
You are a
emeritus.
There we
Shakespeare,
go.
As of yesterday. And I write mystery, thriller, fantasy, science fiction, some for kids, some for adults.
And every once in a great while, you'll even write a short story.
Once in a while, yeah.
So, but we're not really here to talk about your past achievements, even your recent past achievements. We're here to talk about the future.
Yes.
So what do we got coming next?
So what we have coming next is a young adult novel called Hideki Smith, Demon Queller. And it's about a mixed race Japanese family living in North Carolina and having to basically fight forces from Japanese mythology and folklore in the Blue Ridge Mountains, which obviously is where they live.
Of course, because that's all that's in North Carolina, right, is the Blue Ridge Mountains. There's a lot to unpack in this.
There is.
Let's start with one of the obvious questions about the middle-aged British white guy writing about a mixed-race Japanese-American family in North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
Tell the world a little bit about the co-authors for this book and where this came from.
Yeah. So in the late 80s, after I finished my undergraduate degree, I went to Japan.
Okay.
Where I worked for a couple of years and where I met my now wife. We've been married for 30 years. And she is one of the co-authors on the book, Hisako Osako.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also the story of a metaphorical version of the story of our son, Kuma, who is now 20, but I was working on this book a few years ago. So it's sort of positions him as a high school student. And again, this is not a biographical story. Obviously, it's a fantasy adventure, but it takes some of what we have sort of collectively learned
Mm-hmm.
about being a mixed race family in North Carolina and uses that to anchor a story about monsters and demons and ancestry.
Well, because good fiction is rooted in truth. And any character that's effective is going to be rooted in truth. So your truth and your family's truth and experiences add a layer of color to these characters and kind of the push-pull between worlds of Hideki and his sister in the book.
Yeah. And about not just being Japanese American, but being mixed race.
Yes.
Japanese American. And therefore having this, growing up with a sense that you are sort of both and neither,
Mm-hmm.
right? That you participate in, you partake of two radically different cultures, neither of which you are fully immersed in. You know, I mean, so, Kuma was 12 before we took him to Japan. He had never been, and had not particularly expressed interest in going until we went. And when we came back, he was like, "Well, when can we go back? When can we go back? When can we go back?" And I talk about this in the afterword to the book. And I said to him, "What is it? What's the appeal of being in Japan?" And he said, "Well, I love the food." And I was like, "Okay, yeah, but we can get Japanese food in other places, you know." And he had never grown up. He wasn't an anime fan. He wasn't into all the sort of Japanese
stuff that you're into,
bands that I'm into, right?
In case you've missed AJ's J Metal, Baby Metal YouTube channel, we'll put a link in the show notes that'll point you towards him talking about
various Japanese rock bands,
various Asian heavy metal bands.
Yes, good to know. And so
Still saying, turning me on to polka dot stingray is one of the best things you've ever done for me.
I'm going to see them live in 3 weeks in Kanazawa. I'm going to see them. Yeah.
I hate you a little right now.
I know.
I'm really jealous. And see how big they make t-shirts. Because I'm going to guess that there might not be very many that would fit me.
I'll look.
Because
yeah.
I'm beefy for an American guy.
But just to come back to what we were saying, when pushed in the end, when I was saying, what is it that you like? What did you like about being in Japan that makes you want to go back? And he said, it's nice to be somewhere where everybody looks like me.
Yeah.
And that was quite hard.
I'm sure.
And because he has always been very sort of level-headed and sort of unflappable, but in the course of the subsequent conversations, he was dealing with a lot of sort of low-key stuff,
right.
That he didn't think worth drawing our attention to, but stuff was said, stuff was,
You do that. You talk about that a lot in the book.
Yeah.
There's a lot of examples of that kind of low-key subtextual xenophobia.
Yeah.
In Hideki's interactions with kids at school,
right.
and other things, and some of his interactions with his grandmother,
right.
Because he isn't white enough for the white kids or Japanese enough for his grandmother.
Right, exactly, yes. So, and that's the problem, right? This sense of trying to sort of construct an identity when you are in some ways made to feel like you don't quite belong in either area. And then having to figure out who you are if you're neither of those things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what did you draw on for the mythology and the monsters for this book in particular? Because it essentially is Hideki Smith versus Oni Mountain, kind of.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is something that I've always been fascinated with. If I was really honest, it's part of the reason I went to Japan in the first place, because I was always fascinated by elements of Japanese folk culture as manifested in those sort of ukiyo-e woodblock prints and things like that. Yeah, the objects of the floating world. It's in the 19th century, you get these prints that came to the West frequently as sort of wrapping paper and such, but those sort of classic Japanese prints that are full of incredibly rich and striking detail and color, but often depict, kabuki actors in full makeup and samurai warriors, but also elements of this sort of shadow world of creatures, animals that are quasi-supernatural. You mentioned kitsune before, the fox, the shape-shifting fox, like on the
similar to
shirt. Yes,
except there need to be 8 more tails.
It depends on the fox.
Really?
There are different forms that the multiple tail fox is often associated with attaining a certain age. Often it's 100 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there are foxes can manifest in a lot of different ways. A lot of the sort of most iconic stories are of men who marry fox women who have sort of transformed into women and lived their entire lives as women, and then maybe something triggers. Or the man does something and the fox transforms back into a fox. And sometimes it gets caught somehow.
In David Eddings' series, The Bulgaria, he lifts that concept of a woman who is a wolf transforming into being a person and living decades or centuries as a human, and then shifting back later, and I didn't realize that that's where he had pulled that from.
I don't know if that's exactly where you got it from, but certainly that's a familiar story.
Yeah.
So yes, so those kind of things, and a host of other strange and a lot of them, not the Naparabo and other kind of creatures, it's there's a great story by an American who was living in Japan in the 19th century called Lafcadio Hearn, and he produces a short story collection called Queller, which is basically stories reported to him by his wife, his Japanese wife, from old folklore. And one of the stories that he talks about, which is in the collection, is called Mujina. Story centers on a guy who is out late at night and he bumps into a beautiful woman in a sort of full kimono, and her face is shielded with a parasol, and he approaches her and starts to talk to her, at which point she reveals her face, and the face is like an egg. And that's the phrase that he uses. There's no eyes, no nose, no, just completely blank.
Super
so
creepy.
He freaks out.
You think?
Yeah. And he goes running off into the night and like trying to find civilization, and he comes across a soba noodle seller by the side of the road, and he starts telling him what has happened, this appalling thing. And the noodle seller's like, I don't understand. What are you talking about? And as he's explaining what he saw, the noodle seller says, was it like this? And the face disappears. It's great, right? It's great.
That's terrifying. Oh my God.
Because it's like suddenly they're everywhere.
Yeah.
So yes, there's some really great stories that come out of this tradition earlier, because every time the Nakarabo or Mujina gets evoked, it's always in that sort of double story where you encounter it and it's like then a dream within a dream where you think you've woken up but you've not, so that sort of the double hit is key to the story. So I loved stuff like that and I wanted to incorporate it, but every time I tried to write a story that was specifically about Japan or Japanese culture, my separateness from it made that feel inauthentic.
Okay. Yeah.
I didn't own it. It wasn't entirely my experience. I was looking at it from the outside, and I tried versions of the story a number of times over the last 25 years or so, in radically different ways, radical different forms of the story. And it was only, I think, after having these conversations with my son and thinking, okay, so maybe I find a way to tell this story in a specifically American context and not try to make it about Japan and Japanese culture, but about an intersection between what is Japanese and what is American, and in my case, British, English, and this sort of the natural conflicts and hybridity of that collision. And that's where the story was going to come from. And to center it on somebody like my son and his sister in the story, and then come up with a plot line that would justify within the story why this is happening here, and who these people are, and how they came to be here, and what has effectively followed them.
And it really does feel like in the story, it feels like you are telling a story that you do own a part of, because you are obviously a part of your son's life. And the dad in this book's also British.
Yes, and that was deliberate, right? Because I didn't want to be sort of thinking myself into the protagonist's position, even though I'm doing the bulk of the writing and centering it on Caleb, Hideki. I wanted there to be a figure in the book who was clearly me, or a version of me, or somebody who I would be able to associate with and say, that's my anchor.
Yeah.
Right? And then this other stuff, centering on the rest of the family, is somebody else's experience, and that's what I'm going to try to.
From an editor standpoint, good call. Because from an editor's standpoint, I would have wanted you to have a character like that, so that one, it does anchor you, the writer, to something that does a main character that does have more shared experiences with you,
Right.
but also it deflects some of the natural criticism
Yeah.
of you telling a story that isn't necessarily yours,
Right.
despite the fact that it is a story that you have tangentially experienced.
Yeah. And part of the point also was to sort of to write it so that even for the main character, the Japaneseness of this of that side of his family
Is
was
foreign.
something that he was completely baffled by, that he didn't have experience of it, that he didn't know it. And so you have something that I think always works well in any kind of mystery or adventure, when you're up against something that you don't understand and you don't know how it's going to manifest and you don't understand the rules, and the people who do know the rules think that you're not up to the task.
It
because you're not
inherently
really
it inherently sets the stakes high
Yeah.
for your protagonist.
and further raises the sense of conflict that he doesn't, because he feels inadequate for not knowing this stuff. He doesn't feel like he's capable of it because he's not Japanese enough.
And that's an interesting transition in the book, because so much of the background of Caleb Hideki's development has been not being American or not being white enough.
Yeah.
That now that he is, and he has sublimated any desire to learn
Yeah.
about his Japanese culture, but now having to learn or die and let the world end, or
Right.
it's a fantasy novel. Somebody's
Yeah.
going to have to save the damn world.
Yeah.
So, but I feel like that is something that works very well within the book, is that shift of his internal perspective from all the kids at school say you're not white enough,
Right.
and now you're not Japanese enough.
Yeah.
And well, hell.
Yeah.
And also, you're also 16, so you're screwed in so many ways.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things that has just been happening over the last few weeks is that my mother-in-law read the book, and that has and was very enthusiastic about it. And I had sort of touched base with her as well, because there are some things that she knew about Japan and language and such that my wife didn't know. But it's interesting because it has led to conversations between my wife and her mother about what it was like growing up in America in ways that they had not really talked about. Because in some ways, my mother-in-law's position is that very, very Japanese immigrant position of we do not experience racism in this country because we choose to ignore it or whatever. And we will assimilate. We will be part of this society. So it's been really interesting.
So your mother-in-law is a first-generation immigrant?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, she grew up in Tokyo during the war. It's an interesting story. My father-in-law was actually born in the U.S. His father had moved to California, but then his father was interred during the war in a camp in Arizona, and they thought it would be safer for my father-in-law to go back to Japan. So he actually, he went back to Kagoshima, and tells stories about watching dogfights between Zeros and Mustangs and such over. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and taking food after the sort of the bombings.
And your father-in-law also contributed to the book as well, in a way.
He helped out. One of the things that we have at the end of the book is a glossary of some of the Japanese terms and what they mean and so on. And we thought it would be nice to sort of hand draw the kanji and the Japanese characters And my wife initially was wary of taking that on herself, so she consulted with her father before doing it. So in the end, she actually did the actual kanji, but he sort of talked her through, and she was anxious about it because she thinks they don't look sufficiently professionally Japanese. But in some ways, that's the point, right? Because this is a book about
It's a book about family.
yeah,
At the end of the day, it's a book about family, and then at the end of the day, it's a book by family.
yeah, and about family that is and is not Japanese and various other
Is
things.
not
So,
Japanese, is not
yeah.
white, is Japanese,
Yeah.
is white.
So if everything came out looking absolutely pristine, like it had all been done by a native Japanese speaker, in some ways that would be wrong, right?
Yeah,
So,
I agree.
Yeah,
All right. So that's Hideki Smith, Demon Queller.
it is.
That will be available everywhere books are sold, August 24th, by former Professor AJ Hartley.
Indeed.
All right. Well, congrats on your retirement.
Thank you.
And we're
Such
taping
as
this.
it is.
We're taping this quite a bit in advance because now that you're retired, you have plenty going on and way too much planned.
Yeah, yeah. So yes, we wanted to do this because I'm going to be going to Japan for the first time since the pandemic started. So it's been 4 years since we were there. And so
Well, fly safe
thank you.
because I kind of want to release this book.
Yes, indeed.
And you can go to falstaffbooks.com and follow the links in the show notes, and there'll be a little image somewhere on your screen that will have a QR code that you can just point your phone at, and you can pre-order Hideki Smith, Demon Queller, right now. So until next time, I'm John Hartness. I'm the founder and publisher of Falstaff Books, and you've been watching Author Talks on the Falstaff Books YouTube channel. Bye.